Sony did it. They made a camera that improves every single feature of the FX3 and gave us filmmakers almost everything we ever wanted or asked for, plus things that we didn't ask for that I'm also incredibly excited about. This is the Sony FX5, and I've not been this excited about a camera since the A7S III launch way back in 2020. Let's talk about it, because it's time to review the FX5. As always though, for the sake of ethics, I want you to know this video is not paid or sponsored by Sony. They loaned me this camera so I can make this review, and I am so sad that I have to return it, but I will be pre-ordering one because I have so many videos that I want to make about this camera. Now, at first glance, the FX5 doesn't actually look that different from the FX3, and Sony told me that that was by design. Filmmakers really like the form factor and size of the FX3, so why change it? That said, if you look closer, the body is slightly larger, especially when it comes to the thickness, but it's still light in the hand. The weight feels very similar to the FX3. I also have to admit, I was wrong in some of my predictions about this camera. I thought for sure that Sony would include the EVF from the FX2 on the FX5, but no, there's no built-in EVF, but that doesn't mean that the screen hasn't changed or that there's not an EVF. More on that in a second. Look at the back of the camera and you will see the first of a couple big changes, and that is the screen. We begged Sony for it, and I'm frankly shocked that they did it. This screen is now significantly larger at 3.5 inches in size, but it still keeps the fold out as well as tilting style from the A7 IV. And more importantly, with the screen on the FX3, that was in the 4:3 aspect ratio, which when you were filming in 16:9, that would add black bars to the top and bottom of your image preview, making it really more like a 2-inch video preview, which was usable. I used it for many years, but I think this new screen upgrade was really smart because it's now in the 16:9 aspect ratio, which perfectly matches the video that you're going to be recording, unless you want to film in open gate, of course. Little teaser for that we're going to talk about in a minute. But my point is that when recording in 16:9, this video preview will fill up much more of the screen, making it much larger to view and a more immersive filmmaking experience, which is fantastic. Now, back to that EVF. Like I said, there is no EVF for the FX5 because Sony heard what everybody was asking for so long in so many comments, and they said, fine, forget the FX2 EVF, how about a detachable one? Yes, they now make an EVF that's right here that will bolt onto the top of the camera onto a port that is in front of the hot shoe. So you simply remove the cover, stick it down right on top, and then screw it in. So if you want an EVF, you've got it with this camera. And if not, this EVF is actually sold separately so you can save money and not buy it if you don't want it. And I have to say, this EVF really feels like it's built for filmmaking. It has a 16:9 widescreen aspect ratio, just like the screen on the back of the camera. It's great. But I hear you telling me, Matt, that's cool, but what if I want to use the hot shoe for something else, like maybe an XLR audio handle, for example? Well, that is the only real wrinkle with this setup. So yes, the FX5 does have an optional XLR handle that you can buy, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But the issue with this XLR handle and the EVF is that both of them cover the hot shoe whenever you use them, and they both use the same 2 mounting bolts on top to connect. But here's an interesting workaround. Sony tells me they're partnering with my friends at Condor Blue to make an external EVF extension cable, meaning that if you want to build out a camera rig to your FX5, you could mount the EVF to a cage and still have it connected and working with your camera. Or you could use it on a shoulder rig for remote viewing. It doesn't have to be covering the hot shoe here. Unfortunately though, the EVF still does need to connect to this proprietary port at the top of the FX5, and the XLR handle is going to completely cover that once you attach it to the camera. So I'm hoping we could see Condor Blue rig up a hot shoe extension or some sort of cutout that would enable you to use the EVF extension cable with the XLR handle. That's really one of the very few complaints that I have about this camera, but I also wonder how many people will actually be buying the external EVF and using it. So please let me know in the comments if this is something that you will buy and use. Speaking of things you want to use, by the way, and talking about Condor Blue here, I have a audio pack that I made with Condor Blue that comes with all the essential audio cables that you need for filmmaking, and it works with this XLR handle. It's pretty cool. I'll link to this down in the video description as well. Anyways, look at the back of the camera now and you will see the next change. The buttons are now very different. There is a back button and a clips button and a home button. And really, I want you to pay attention to the right side of the camera here because this is a big change. The control wheel that you normally see on the back of a Sony camera is now gone. You have lost all of these buttons over here because the screen is so much larger. You only have a custom button, a home button, and a user button. These buttons are all pulled from Sony's ultra high-end Venice camera, and it does take some getting used to. This is also your first indicator that Sony is taking a lot more of the DNA from their cinema line of cameras and adding them to the FX5. We have a ton of features that you would normally see on the Venice that we're going to talk about with this camera soon, but I want to preface talking about them by saying that unlike the FX3, which takes a lot of its DNA from Sony's photo line, like the A7S III, for example, the FX5, on the other hand, takes much more of its DNA from the Venice and Burano. And that would be no more obvious to you than whenever you first turn on the camera, because you will notice that the camera does not use the menu system from the Alpha line of cameras. No, it uses a system that looks like it'd be far more home on a Venice camera. It's less colorful, it's more gray and yellow and professional. Sony told me this was intentional because they want to make this camera be a stepping stone to a Burano or a Venice. In the past, if you were starting in filmmaking, the thinking is that you would purchase something like an FX30 or FX2 or FX3, but then if you wanted to upgrade to a Burano or Venice, that would be a tough jump because the interface controls and menus all look so significantly different. With the FX5 being designed as a stepping stone, though, the menus and interface still take some cues from the Alpha line, so you'll be able to pick up on how they work quickly, but they're similar enough to the Burano and Venice that you could very easily pick up one of those cameras and use them once you know how to use the FX5. In other words, the FX5 is more of a cinema camera than anything else. And to drive that point home, here is another one of the few cons that I found with this camera, and this may actually upset you a little bit if you're coming from the FX3, and that is that the FX5 is not actually capable of taking raw photos. Heck, you can't even take stills with the camera. This is a video camera in the purest sense of the term. No photos allowed, even though there's a nice button here that you would think, oh, let's take some photos. Nope, can't do it. But that said, Sony did tell me they have a robust firmware roadmap built out for this camera, and one of the features of that roadmap will be the addition of a setting where you can take screenshots of your videos that you've recorded in the camera. So that's at least something. There are more exciting firmware updates coming too. We're going to talk about those in a little bit. Otherwise though, wrapping up the rest of the body, with the lack of the control dial on the back now, operating the camera is different and does take some getting used to. Instead of using your thumb to operate the control wheel, which doesn't exist on this camera, you have to either hold the camera differently to use the control joystick at the top or use the touchscreen controls on the camera, which is not necessarily a bad thing now that the screen is so much larger. Like I said though, it takes some getting used to, but if you consider this isn't a photo camera you're going to be holding up to your eye, and is instead a video camera that you're going to hold down at your chest, it makes controlling the camera with the top joystick and your thumb much more easy and intuitive. Otherwise, just like the FX3, there's still a fan inside the camera with a very similar vent on the side for cooling. There's still a headphone jack and a microphone jack on the side, but these are now exposed without a flap to cover them, which makes them more easy to access. There is still a full-size HDMI port. Yay! There is also the addition of a second USB Type-C port, just like on the A7 IV, and I'm happy to tell you that with the launch of this camera, Sony also announced a USB Type-C timecode cable that will work with this camera. So if you love timecode like me, you're going to be very happy that you can now hardwire timecode in with this new cable, which is great news. What about weird news, though? Well, open up the other port over here on the side, and that's where things get really interesting because Sony added an Ethernet jack. Yeah, this is something you would normally see on a high-end sports camera. I believe Sony has it on like their A9, and I think the A1 has it too. Sony added it to this camera as well because they said that a lot of people are using these cameras for remote filmmaking rigs, and this can be a great way to control a camera with Ethernet, so that's cool. I guess my only wish would be that you could swap out this port for an EVF port to have it work with the XLR handle simultaneously, or maybe SDI. Could you give us that, Sony? Oh well, Ethernet's interesting, I guess. Now, speaking of that XLR handle, let's get back to the hot shoe at the top of this camera. Just like the photocentric version of the handle that they added with the A7R6, the FX5 handle supports 32-bit float audio recording at up to 96 kilohertz, which is wonderful to hear about because it gives you so much more flexibility when recording. If your audio is too quiet, you can bring it up without adding noise. If it's peaking, you can bring the audio down without distortion. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, the handle includes screws to help mount to the body, so this is a much more robust attachment than what you get with the A7R6, and this works very well. Hello, this is an audio quality test of the Sony FX5. I have a D80S Mic 3 running into the XLR hot shoe, and as you can hear, I think it sounds pretty darn good. So glad to finally have 32-bit float audio recording with this camera. Last, but definitely not least though, pop open the memory card door on the other side of the camera, and you will see that you are greeted with dun dun dun, the exact same memory card slots you are used to. Yes, SD and CF Express Type A combo slots. No, Sony did not add a Type B or anything like that, but hold up, because up until this point, with all of their other modern cameras like the FX3, FX30, etc., there hasn't really been a need for you to use CF Express Type A for filmmaking. And what I mean by that is, aside from literally one video format, which would be XAVCSI in S&Q mode in 4K at 120 frames per second, literally all other video formats on the FX3 can be recorded with just a V90 SD card, which is much more affordable. So it's always made it hard for me to recommend CF Express Type A cards. But I'm happy to tell you that Sony has finally given us filmmakers a reason to purchase these higher-end memory cards, because they've finally given the FX5 a feature that it needed those higher bit rates for. And this is something I've been hoping for years, that I predicted, but it's actually even better than I thought. And that is that Sony finally chose to include internal RAW video recording with the FX5. And I can see you kind of side-eyeing me already here, okay? Like, really, Matt? You're excited about this? Like, literally all of their competition have offered RAW video for years now. Canon had internal RAW with the R5 in 2020. Nikon bought Red, and you can now get Red RAW in the ZR. Panasonic has had internal ProRes RAW on their cameras for years now, but hold up, because Sony didn't do any of that. Instead, Sony looked at the Venice camera and said, hey, we have our own flavor of ultra high quality 16-bit linear RAW, which looks insanely good and gives you a ridiculous amount of flexibility in post. And they said, hey, let's put that in the FX5 and give filmmakers the ability to adjust their white balance and exposure and highlights and shadows and color temperature, etc., in post. What the heck? It looks so good. This is the best that I've ever seen a Sony camera look that isn't a Venice or Burano. The footage is gorgeous. But hold up, because a lot of filmmakers don't love filming in RAW, because even though it looks amazing, the file sizes have historically sucked pretty much across the board. Canon offers compressed RAW, but it's still huge. ProRes RAW is massive. Even Red RAW on the Nikon ZR has basically no compression, and you're quickly gonna find yourself needing to buy multi-terabyte memory cards, which are not cheap, to keep up with it all. In short, RAW is too big of a format and memory cards are too expensive. But here's where it gets crazy though. Sony's engineers have worked some insane compression magic, because the FX5 is capable of filming in 3 flavors of x-ocn RAW, which is Sony's proprietary flavor of RAW. And they are x-ocn LT, which is already a pretty small file size for RAW, but then they went even further and added a C1 and a C2 version of RAW with even higher compression levels and smaller file sizes, which, to be clear, whichever flavor of RAW you choose, you are still getting 16-bit RAW color. It's just a smaller, more compressed file size. But how small are we talking about? Here's the crazy comparison. All 3 of these RAW bit rates are lower than if you were able to film regular ProRes in the camera. And the C1 and C2 options are dramatically smaller. We are talking smaller than filming some of the H.265 formats on the camera. Let me put it this way. If your eyes are glazing over with numbers and tech here, the reason I'm so excited about this is that Sony has just released the first camera that is not an ultra high-end Red cinema camera with a crazy level level of RAW compression that actually makes filming in RAW feasible for basically anything you want to film because the file sizes are now small enough. A lot of filmmakers would avoid shooting in RAW because they wanted smaller file size, so they chose to skip all the benefits of recording in RAW and opted for just 10-bit color. And I say just 10-bit because for comparison, 10-bit color still gives you a lot of colors. We are talking over 1 billion colors. But 16-bit linear RAW in this camera, on the other hand, gives you 280 trillion colors. It's so much more. So, do you see my point? I have full intentions of buying this camera and actually using RAW video all the time with it because it's finally possible and financially feasible, which is so exciting. And know how I was telling you earlier that Sony finally has a reason for you to buy CF Express Type A cards to work with their cameras so you can film in RAW? Well, that was actually kind of a lie, because by my testing, Sony is crazy, but you don't actually have to buy CF Express Type A cards to film in RAW. No, you can actually just use V90 or even V60 SD cards and still record in RAW with this camera, which is absolutely insane. To be clear, there are limitations. You can only film up to about 30 FPS in 5K to an SD card. You will need a CF Express Type A card to film in 5K at 60 FPS RAW, but that is still really impressive. And if you're trying to convince your girlfriend or boyfriend or lover that you need to buy this camera, tell them how much money you're gonna save by not needing to buy new memory cards, because it basically makes the camera free. You owe it to yourself to buy it. Tell them Matt said it's okay, it's saving you money. By the way, I'm working on a full FX5 memory card buyer's guide video too, so please subscribe if you want to see that. Should be helpful to you as you are picking out cards to use with this camera. Anyways, let's keep moving here. We ain't even close to being done yet because now I need to blow your mind with the sensor. There was a lot of leaks, a lot of rumors leading up to this release saying this camera would have a global shutter sensor, but I'm sorry to tell you no, it does not. But in my opinion, that's okay because this sensor is really the purest and highest end CMOS sensor that Sony has ever released. And yes, I did just spit on it while talking. Dang it. Anyways, once we start talking about what this sensor is capable of, you're not going to be upset at all, either about it being CMOS or about my spit on the sensor. Well, you still might be upset about that. First of all, this is a full frame, fully stacked sensor. So it's basically using Sony's latest and greatest tech, but there are a few really big things that are actually gonna matter to you as a filmmaker here. Starting with, this sensor is 16.6 megapixels. So with this higher resolution, the FX5 is now capable of recording at up to 5K, which may not sound like that big of a jump coming from 4K. That's actually going from 8 million pixels to 14 million though in 16:9, which is a massive 69% jump, which will make it much easier on you whenever you need to reframe things in post to deliver them in 4K. It is great. Even better, I'm so glad I finally get to say these words. OpenGate is here. Yes, the FX5 is capable of filming in OpenGate in up to 5K at 60 frames per second with a ton of anamorphic de-squeeze options available. 1.3, 1.5, 1.6, 1.8, 2.0. If you have an anamorphic lens, it should work great with this camera. I'm excited to test it. Oh, and remember how I was just talking about how the sensor can record 69% more pixels? That was just with regular 16:9. If you count OpenGate, this camera records literally double the pixels of 4K. It is wild. Keep in mind, it can only film OpenGate in RAW, but remembering the RAW file sizes are actually manageable with this camera, I think that's fine. But what about the frame rates, Matt? Well, I want you to remember back in 2020, Sony kind of blew filmmakers' minds whenever they added 4K at 120 frames per second to the A7S III. We were all just asking for 4K 60 and they said, hey, how about double that? Well, this is where things get crazy because not only is the FX4 capable of filming in 5K at up to 60 frames per second in OpenGate, but hold up. Because if you crank the resolution down to 4K at the launch of this camera, out of the box, it is capable of filming in 4K at 120 frames per second with a very small crop, which is good to see. But here is where I need you to hold on to your beard. Okay, remember how I told you that Sony said they have a robust firmware roadmap plan for this camera? Well, the biggest feature by far, in my opinion, is that they told me that sometime, they are estimating in 2027, they are going to release a firmware update that unlocks 4K recording at up to 240 frames per second with the FX5, which is stupid in the best possible way. I absolutely love it, and I cannot wait for that update. Everything is gonna be in super slow-mo, baby. Wow. That is insane. But let's keep the insanity going, because remember that with the FX3, this sensor was the perfect size to film in 4K resolution, and there was no way to crop in on the sensor like you could on other Sony cameras, where you could film with a 35mm crop from the center of the sensor, which would give you greater flexibility when using other lenses, as well as basically operating as a free zoom. Well, the FX3 couldn't do that, but the FX5, with its much larger 16 megapixel sensor, is the perfect size to actually do a crop to 35mm from the center, meaning that you get all of this sensor versatility. And in addition, Sony also released an update to their clear image zoom technology, which basically is a lossless quality digital zoom. And now clear image zoom will work in combination with a zoom lens to basically give you a super smooth optical and digital zoom together. So you could throw something like a 70 to 200mm lens on the camera, and whenever you enable clear image zoom, that would turn it into a 70 to 300mm lens. Or you could enable the 35mm crop and actually make it more like a 450mm lens, which is pretty awesome. But hold up, because I know all this talk about a newer and bigger sensor is exciting, at least to me here, but one of the biggest fears that I saw so many people worrying about online, myself included, was that if Sony increased the megapixels of the camera, would that hurt the low light performance? Keeping in mind that the one thing that filmmakers absolutely loved about the FX3 was how the sensor had a dual gain ISO at 800 and 12,800, which looked truly amazing in low light. Well, I have great news for you, because if the A7 IV wasn't an indicator that Sony was improving their low light technology, considering that camera had a second base ISO of 8,000, which is basically within spitting difference of the FX3, Sony said, hey, with the FX5, we're gonna give you what you expect, and we're gonna make it even more user-friendly. So this is the first Sony camera that actually has a triple base ISO. Not only do you get ISO 800 on the low end and 12,800 on the high end, just like on the FX3, Sony also gives you a middle base ISO now of 4,000, which I think is so great, because I have had so many filmmakers message me over the years saying they wish there was something in the middle, because it can be kind of hard in some filmmaking scenarios to get all the way up to ISO 12,800 without overexposing, but 800 was too dark. This is Goldilocks now. We have ISO 4,000 in the middle, and it's going to be great. Now, what was one of the other complaints that a lot of filmmakers had, especially about the FX3 when it came to filming in higher ISOs with noise? Well, the FX3 was notorious, let's say, for being very aggressive with noise reduction, which would over soften the image at high ISOs, and you would lose a lot of detail. This led a lot of filmmakers to switch to an FX6, because that camera would actually let you disable the noise reduction, which some filmmakers like the look of better. But that disabling feature was something you would only get on Sony's higher-end cinema cameras, FX6, FX9, Burano, Venice, not the FX3. Well, remembering that the FX5 is taking more from the Venice DNA, I'm so happy to tell you this camera does include the ability for you to disable noise reduction, which I have to say, at the higher base ISOs like 12,800, it actually looks really good turned off and really cinematic without it. So you have some really nice controls here to tweak it. But that said, if you are planning on just cranking up your ISO super high to 32,000 or something like that, I would probably turn the noise reduction back on, but you do you. I'm just glad this camera gives us the option as filmmakers. Now, are we done talking about ISO and noise performance? Not yet, actually, because one of the coolest features that Sony added to the A7R6 was a feature called dual gain, which, please do not confuse that with the triple base ISO that we talked about earlier. That is different here, okay? Dual gain is something that other cameras like Panasonic have offered, and it's so great to see it now on Sony, because whenever you enable this dual gain feature, which you can select by choosing ISO 800 dual gain, it basically makes it so whenever the camera is recording a video, it combines the low and high base ISO of the camera camera together. The camera will literally record a lower exposed and a higher exposed image, and then combine those together as the video is recorded, which essentially gives your footage a higher dynamic range. Sony says this camera is capable of over 15 stops of dynamic range, and by my testing, it is definitely up there. Filming RAW and S-Log3 with the dual gain setting on, it looks so stinking good, and there is so much room to push and pull the shadows and highlights. Let me just say too, if I haven't already emphasized it enough in all the footage that I'm showing you in this video, the footage from the FX5 is truly stellar. And in my opinion, it's some of the best footage that Sony has ever offered out of any camera. Filming in 16-bit RAW with the FX5 is such a jump in quality, and there is so much more flexibility in post and color grading that it is insane, and the file sizes are still relatively small. It's amazing. And we aren't done. What else have filmmakers been begging Sony for years? Scopes. You want scopes? Sony said, okay, we've been hiding them until this camera. You've got waveforms, you've got vector scopes. There's a new button on the back that says false color. Press it immediately. You've got false color enabled, and it works really well. It's so nice to have this built into the camera now. And let me just say, the screen is now large enough to actually make it feasible to use this feature. And I really like the layout of the menus around the screen too. They basically keep the preview clear while still showing you basically all of the settings that you need. Of course, like I said earlier, this camera is coming from a lot of the Venice DNA, so you still get the big 6 menu. But I do want to point out that Sony is still taking some of the best parts from their photo lineup and putting them in this camera. So autofocus has always been for their cinema line. Not anymore though, because they have taken the great autofocus from the Alpha line and put it into this camera. It has the same Bion's XR2 processor with the built-in AI unit, and so the autofocus on this camera is the absolute best that you can get from Sony, and both it and the IBIS are greatly improved. If you are coming from an FX3, you're going to be impressed by how much better it is, and the FX3 was good. So focus and IBIS is great. I have no complaints, but speaking of IBIS, by the way, here's a very interesting capability that Sony has added to the FX5. You can completely disable the IBIS if you want, as in hard lock the sensor so it won't move at all. For a long time, some filmmakers have asked for this because even with the IBIS off, the sensor can shake around. So this is great news. But there is a catch. The catch is that you have to send your FX5 into a Sony service center for them to physically lock the sensor. I'm pretty sure you can also have it unlocked too, but this isn't something you can just do at home without dismantling the camera, so it's something that their service center needs to handle. It's kind of like Sony is offering an IBIS and non-IBIS camera, which I think is great. And just like the external EVF, this is another feature that filmmakers have been asking for, and I'm so glad to see Sony now offer. All that said, if I had to choose one final complaint, aside from the XLR and EVF not working simultaneously and the camera not being able to take photos, literally the only other complaint that I have, which I can also see other filmmakers having, is of course that Sony didn't fulfill one request, one that a lot of filmmakers are hoping and dreaming for, and that is that there is no internal ND filter for this camera. I have talked to Sony's engineers about this, and they've told me that that is too big and the technology isn't there yet, and I understand. I do want them to break the laws of physics somehow and make it work at some point, but I think that they wanted to keep the size of this camera very close to the FX3. So that makes sense why it does not have a built-in internal ND filter. And I think that whenever Sony looks at their sales data and they see how many people have bought the FX3, they probably see that filmmakers are still buying that camera and using ND filters on their lenses, so it makes sense. Do I still want to see an electronic ND or Sony figure out some magic for an ND filter in a future small camera like this? Absolutely, but it hasn't happened yet. Anyways, back to things I definitely do not see people complaining about, and that would be the battery life of this camera. The FX5 uses Sony's new NPSA 100 battery, which gives this camera about 20 minutes longer battery life than the FX3, which was already pretty darn good. So in my testing, I have to say the battery life is really impressive. And if you are filming longer events, let's say really long wedding ceremonies, you're probably not gonna love having to buy new batteries, but the extra battery life is nice, and the camera does come with a dual battery charger as well, which is a nice touch. What about overheating, Matt? We got the fan on the side, but this camera is basically the same size as the FX3, which never had an issue with overheating thanks to its fan, but the FX5 also records significantly higher resolutions and raw video, which definitely made me a little nervous about potential overheating. Not to mention, Sony chose to send me this camera to test in the middle of summer in Texas, where it is oftentimes over 100 degrees. Unfortunately though, where I live in Texas has been experiencing horrific flooding and rains the entire time that I had the camera. It's wild down here. So I did not have time to fully test the overheating. I didn't want to stand out there in the rain and be like, well, it didn't overheat, because that's kind of useless here. So I would love if you would consider subscribing, because I am planning on doing a full overheating test of the FX5 once it releases and the weather is better. And that brings us to talking about the price of the FX5, which is a topic that I was definitely a bit nervous about, considering how much the prices of electronics have gone up recently. But I have to say though, I correctly predicted this price in a video several months back. To preface, Sony said that they wanted to try to keep the price of the FX5 as low as possible. And to do that, the cheapest version that they sell doesn't come with any accessories. So unlike the FX3 where you were forced to purchase an XLR handle with it, the FX5 is more like the FX30 where the XLR handle is optional. Because of that, this base level of the FX5 comes in at $5,000, which is definitely a healthy price to pay, and about $1,200 over my estimate of what the FX3 initially cost when it first released, and about $800 more than it costs right now. Keeping in mind that Sony is not continuing the FX3 and is still going to be making that as a camera that lives on as a more budget-friendly alternative to the FX5. That said, if you want to purchase an FX5 with the XLR handle, Sony tells me that it'll cost $5,600, and they have not told me the price for the standalone EVF or Timecode cable, but I'm sure that B&H will probably have a package where they put them all together for purchase as well. And now, considering where this camera is positioned in the lineup as being better than the FX3, but not having built-in ND filters like the FX6, I gotta say, the FX5 still feels like a big upgrade in the specs department over both of those two cameras. And $5,000 feels fair to me for everything that Sony is offering, and I'm very glad that we're not seeing a $6,000 or $7,000 camera, which honestly would not have surprised me as well. Like I said though, I'm gonna be putting my money where my mouth is, and I'll be picking one of these up as soon as possible because I really love filming with Sony, and it feels like the FX5 puts them back on top. For a long time, me as well as many other YouTubers made videos about whether a certain new camera would be an FX3 killer, but it turns out that the only camera that could kill the FX3 would come from Sony in the FX5. And then they're like, hey, we aren't even killing the FX3, you can still buy it. This is just a more advanced model, which makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that if I have to wait another 5 or 6 years for the next big advancement from Sony, that's okay, because the FX5 gave filmmakers basically everything they were asking for, which is pretty cool. Like I said earlier, I'll link to where you can buy the FX5 for the best possible price down in the video description. And while you're down there, I will also link to my edit videos like a pro guide. This guide is going to show you my biggest rules that I follow as a video editor, and I know it's going to be extremely helpful to you. You can download it completely for free at the link in the video description. Thanks so much for watching. Please consider subscribing if you want to see more videos about the FX5, because I have a lot coming. And have a great day.